They called me paranoid, obsessive, a bitter old woman who couldn't let go. My own daughter looked me in the eye and said, "Mom, you're just jealous that someone finally loves me more than you do." I watched her walk away with him, the man with the perfect smile that never reached his eyes, the man whose hand gripped her wrist just a little too tight, the man who somehow always knew exactly where she was, who she talked to, what she was thinking. Everyone told me to stop. The police, her friends, even my own sister said I needed therapy. But a mother knows, a mother always knows. So I kept digging. And what I found in his past made my blood run cold, disappeared. Wives, fake names, a trail of women who trusted the wrong man. Then one morning I turned on the news, and there he was, in handcuffs. And suddenly no one was calling me crazy anymore. This is the story of how I saved my daughter's life, even when she hated me for trying. And trust me, you won't believe how it ends. My name is Mary Peterson. I'm 63 years old, and for the past 5 years I've lived alone in the same small house where my husband and I raised our daughter. I used to be a librarian before I retired, spending my days surrounded by books and quiet voices. Now my days are quieter, still filled with gardening phone calls with Emily and the kind of solitude that comes when the person you built your life with is gone. Emily is my whole world now, my only child, my greatest achievement. When her father died, we held each other through the grief, two women learning to navigate a world that suddenly felt too big and too empty. She was 25 then, just starting her career as a marketing coordinator, full of ambition and hope. I watched her heal, watched her grow stronger, and I was so proud of the woman she'd become. So when she called that Sunday morning, her voice bright with excitement, saying she wanted me to meet someone special, my heart swelled with happiness. Of course I wanted to meet him. Of course I wanted to see my daughter in love. She brought him the following weekend. I'd spent all Saturday cleaning the house, baking her favorite lemon cake, setting the dining table with the good china we only used for special occasions. I wanted everything to be perfect. I wanted to welcome this man who'd made my daughter smile again. When the doorbell rang, I opened it to find Emily practically glowing. She was radiant in a way I hadn't seen in years, her cheeks flushed, her eyes bright. And beside her stood David Morrison. He was handsome, I'll give him that. Tall, well-dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and dark slacks, with the kind of polished appearance that spoke of success and stability. He held out a bouquet of red roses in one hand and an expensive bottle of wine in the other, his smile warm and practiced. "Mrs. Peterson," he said smoothly, his voice deep and confident, "it's such a pleasure to finally meet you. Emily has told me so much about you." I invited them in, and as I arranged the roses in a vase, I listened to him talk. He worked in finance, he said. Portfolio management. He'd moved to town 6 months ago for a job opportunity. He spoke about his work with the easy confidence of someone who was used to impressing people, dropping references to clients, and deals with just the right amount of modesty. During dinner, he complimented everything. The roast was perfect. The cake was the best he'd ever tasted. He asked thoughtful questions about my late husband, about my years at the library, about Emily's childhood. On the surface, he was exactly what any mother would want for her daughter. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was in his eyes. They were sharp, constantly moving, taking in every detail of the room, of me, of Emily. When he smiled, his mouth curved perfectly, but his eyes remained cold, calculating, as if he was performing rather than feeling. And the way he touched Emily, his hand on her knee under the table, his fingers wrapped around her wrist when he reached for the salt. There was a tightness to it, a possessiveness that made my stomach clench. When Emily excused herself to help me bring out dessert, I watched from the kitchen doorway as David's gaze followed her. Not with love or admiration, but with the focused intensity of someone tracking prey. He watched her every movement, noted where she went, what she touched, as if filing it all away for later. "Isn't he wonderful, Mom?" Emily whispered to me in the kitchen, her face alight with happiness. I forced a smile. "He seems very nice, sweetheart." But as they drove away that night, their taillights disappearing down my quiet street, I stood on my porch with my arms wrapped around myself against the evening chill. That night as they drove away, I told myself something about that man just wasn't right. I tried to tell myself I was being ridiculous, that I was seeing problems where none existed, that my unease about David was nothing more than the natural anxiety of a mother watching her only child fall in love with someone new. After all, what did I really have to complain about? He was successful, well-mannered, and clearly devoted to Emily. Maybe I was the problem. Maybe I was the one who needed to let go. But over the next few weeks, small things began to add up in ways I couldn't ignore. It started with the phone calls. Emily and I had always talked several times a week, usually in the evenings after work. We'd chat about nothing important, her day at the office, a funny thing that happened at the grocery store, what we were watching on television. Easy, comfortable conversations between a mother and daughter who'd always been close. But now those calls felt different, constrained. Emily's voice had a new quality to it, a carefulness that hadn't been there before. She'd pause before answering simple questions, as if mentally checking whether her response was acceptable. When I asked if she wanted to come over for lunch on Saturday like we used to, she'd say, "Let me check with David first and get back to you." Check with David, as if she needed permission. One Tuesday evening, I called her cell phone around 7, the time she was usually home from work and settling in for dinner. The phone rang 3 times. Then David answered. "Hello, Mary." His voice was pleasant, smooth, as always. "Oh, David. Hi. I was hoping to catch Emily. Is she around? She's in the shower right now. Can I help you with something?" There was something in his tone, a subtle probing quality, that made me feel like I was being interrogated rather than having a casual conversation with my daughter's boyfriend. No, I just wanted to chat. I'll try her tomorrow." "May I ask what this is about?" he pressed gently. "If it's important, I can have her call you back." "It's nothing important, just mother-daughter talk." I tried to keep my voice light, but my hand had tightened around the phone. "Of course, I'll let her know you called." He hung up before I could say goodbye. The next day, Emily called me back, but the conversation felt rushed, distracted. When I mentioned that David had answered her phone, she laughed it off. "Oh, we share everything. He was probably just trying to be helpful." Share everything. The phrase sat uncomfortably in my chest. A week later, I tried bringing it up more directly. We were on the phone, and I'd noticed she'd canceled our last 2 lunch dates because David had made other plans for them. I chose my words carefully, not wanting to sound accusatory. "Sweetheart, does David always need to know where you are?" I asked gently. "It's just that you used to be more spontaneous, and now it seems like, Mom." Emily's laugh was nervous, a little too bright. "You're overthinking this. David cares about me. He likes to know I'm safe. It's sweet, actually. He's just protective." "I know, honey, but you just don't like anyone taking your place, do you?" The words came out sharp, more bitter than I think she intended. There was a pause, then her voice softened. "I'm sorry. That came out wrong. It's just, I'm happy, Mom. Really happy. I wish you could be happy for me, too." The conversation left me shaken. I sat in my kitchen long after we hung up, staring at my cold cup of tea. Was she right? Was I jealous? Was I so desperate to remain the center of my daughter's world that I was inventing problems with a man who genuinely loved her? I wanted to believe that. I tried to convince myself that my concerns were nothing more than the possessiveness of a lonely widow who didn't want to share her only child. I told myself I was being unfair to David, that I was letting one uncomfortable feeling during a dinner cloud my judgment of an entire relationship. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed remembering stories I'd seen on the evening news over the years. Women who'd been slowly, carefully isolated from their families. Women who'd thought their partners were just caring, just protective, just loving. Women who realized too late that love shouldn't feel like a cage. I prayed I was wrong. I prayed I was just an anxious mother seeing danger where there was only devotion. 2 weeks later, Emily came to visit on a Sunday afternoon. She seemed tense, her smile strained as she sat at my kitchen table. I made tea and brought out cookies, trying to recreate the ease we used to have. We talked about surface things, her work, the weather, a movie she'd seen. But she kept checking her phone, glancing at the time. As she reached for her teacup, her sleeve slid up her arm. And then one afternoon, when Emily came to visit, I saw the bruise on her wrist. The bruise was dark purple, almost black in the center, with yellowing edges that spoke of days-old injury. It wrapped around her wrist in a pattern I recognized immediately, the distinct oval shapes of fingertips, 4 on one side, a thumb on the other. Someone had gripped her hard enough to leave marks that hadn't faded, even after what looked like nearly a week. My hand froze halfway to the teapot. "Emily," I said softly, trying to keep the alarm out of my voice. "What happened to your wrist?" She glanced down and I watched the color drain from her face. In one quick motion, she yanked her sleeve down, covering the bruise, her other hand clutching the fabric to keep it in place. "I just slipped on the stairs, Mom. It's nothing. Really." The words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other. She still wouldn't look at me. Her gaze fixed somewhere over my left shoulder, at the clock on the wall, at the window, anywhere but my eyes. "Sweetheart, that looks like—" "I'm clumsy, that's all. I caught myself on the railing when I tripped. You know how I've always been accident-prone." She let out a laugh that sounded brittle, forced. "Remember when I was 10 and I broke my arm falling off my bike? Same thing. I'm just not careful enough." But she had never been accident-prone. Emily had been a graceful child, coordinated and sure-footed. The broken arm had happened because another kid had pushed her, not because she'd been clumsy. I remembered because I'd been furious with that boy's parents for weeks afterward. I wanted to press further, to take her hand and examine the bruise more closely, to demand the truth. But something in her posture stopped me, the way she'd drawn into herself, shoulders hunched, body angled toward the door as if ready to flee. She looked like a frightened animal, and I realized that if I pushed too hard right now, she might run and never come back. "Okay," I said quietly, though my heart was hammering. "Just be more careful, all right?" She nodded quickly, relief washing over her features. "I will. I should probably get going anyway. David's waiting in the car. He didn't want to come in today. Said he had some calls to make for work." David was waiting outside. Of course he was. Probably checking his watch, tracking how long she'd been inside, wondering what we were talking about. Emily stood abruptly, gathering her purse from the back of the chair. She moved with jerky, nervous energy, rushing toward the door as if she couldn't leave fast enough. I followed her, my mind racing with all the things I wanted to say and couldn't. At the front door, she turned to give me a quick hug, and that's when I heard the soft sound of paper hitting the hardwood floor. A small, folded slip had fallen from her jacket pocket. Emily didn't seem to notice. She was already stepping outside, calling back, "Love you, Mom. I'll call you later this week." I watched her hurry down the walkway to where David's black sedan was parked at the curb. Even from this distance, I could see him in the driver's seat, his face turned toward us, watching, always watching. I closed the door and bent to pick up the paper. It was an appointment card, the kind medical offices give out as reminders. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. Dr. Richard Stevens, licensed clinical psychologist. The appointment was scheduled for this coming Thursday at 2:00 in the afternoon. But it was the note scrawled at the bottom that made my blood run cold. The handwriting was angular masculine, written in blue ink. Anxiety treatment. Patient shows signs of paranoid thinking toward family members. I read it 3 times, each time feeling my stomach sink lower. David had scheduled this appointment. David had written this note. David was telling a mental health professional that Emily was paranoid about her own family. About me. I sank onto the bench by the door, the paper clutched in my shaking hands. This was gaslighting. I'd read about it in magazines, heard about it on talk shows. Making someone believe they were crazy, that their instincts were wrong, that they couldn't trust their own perception of reality. It was a tactic abusers used to maintain control, to isolate their victims, to make them doubt everyone and everything, except the abuser himself. And it was working. I could see it in how Emily had defended him, in how she'd questioned her own mother's motives, in how she'd started to believe that her concerns about their relationship were signs of jealousy rather than legitimate worry. My daughter was being systematically broken down and she didn't even realize it was happening. I wanted to call her immediately to tell her what I'd found, to explain what David was doing. But I knew she wouldn't believe me. She'd say I'd taken the paper without permission, that I was invading her privacy, that I was proving David's point about my inappropriate involvement in their relationship. She might even tell David I'd found it, and then he'd know I was onto him. He'd tighten his control even more. I sat there for a long time as the afternoon light faded, holding that damning piece of paper. Part of me wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe Emily really was struggling with anxiety. Maybe the bruise really was from a fall. Maybe I was seeing sinister intent where there was only genuine concern for my daughter's well-being. But deep in my gut, in that place where maternal instinct lives, I knew better. I knew my daughter. I knew when she was lying. I knew when she was afraid. And I knew with a certainty that made me feel sick that David Morrison was dangerous. The question was, what could I do about it? Who would believe me? Emily herself didn't believe me. And David had already laid the groundwork to paint me as an overbearing, paranoid mother who couldn't accept her daughter's independence. I stood up slowly, my joints aching, and walked to my desk in the corner of the living room. I tucked the appointment card into the top drawer beneath a stack of old Christmas cards I could never bring myself to throw away. Evidence. I was collecting evidence now, though I wasn't sure yet what I'd do with it. That night I prayed for my daughter. Prayed that I was wrong, that my fears were unfounded, that Emily was safe and happy and loved. But part of me feared it was already too late. The weeks that followed were the loneliest of my life, and I'd spent 5 years as a widow. At least in grief, people understood your pain. They brought casseroles and sat with you and let you cry. But this was different. This was watching your child slip away in slow motion, and no one could see it but you. Emily stopped calling. Our regular Tuesday evening chats simply stopped happening. The first week I told myself she was busy. The second week I started calling her instead. But increasingly it wasn't Emily who answered. "Hello, Mary?" David's voice was always smooth, always pleasant, always in control. "Hi, David. Is Emily available?" "She's resting right now. She's had a headache all day. I'll let her know you called." Or, "She's not feeling well today. I think it's best if she gets some sleep. I'll have her call you tomorrow." But tomorrow never brought a return call. When I tried again, the cycle would repeat. David was always polite, always reasonable, always the concerned partner taking care of his unwell girlfriend. And I was always the intrusive mother who couldn't respect boundaries. The few times Emily did answer our conversations were brief and strained. She spoke in a flat, careful voice, as if someone was listening to every word. Maybe someone was. "How are you, sweetheart?" "I'm fine, Mom. Just tired. Work's been busy." "I'd love to see you, maybe lunch this weekend." A pause. "I'll have to check with David. He mentioned wanting to drive up to the lake on Saturday." "Sunday, then." "Mom, I really can't make plans right now. I'll call you when things settle down, okay?" But things never settled down. The invitations I extended were met with excuses. The visits that did happen were painfully short. Emily would arrive looking pale and drawn glance repeatedly at her phone and leave after 20 or 30 minutes with some urgent reason she had to get back. David needed her to pick something up. David wanted her home before dark. David had made dinner reservations. Always David. Her life had become a series of obligations to David. I tried talking to the people in my life, desperate for someone to tell me I wasn't imagining things. My cousin Margaret came over for coffee one morning, and I poured out my concerns while she sat at my kitchen table, listening with an expression of growing concern, though not the kind of concern I'd hoped for. "Mary, honey," she said when I finally stopped talking, "don't you think you might be reading too much into this? Young couples need their space. Emily's building a life with David." "But you don't understand. The bruise, the way he controls her. You saw one bruise and she explained it was an accident. People do have accidents." Margaret reached across the table to pat my hand. "I know this is hard. You raised her to be independent, and now you need to let her go. This is what we all go through when our children grow up." "This isn't about me not wanting her to grow up," I said, my voice rising, despite my efforts to stay calm. "Something is wrong. I can feel it." Margaret's expression shifted to something that looked almost like pity. "Maybe you should talk to someone, Mary, a counselor or therapist. There are people who specialize in helping parents deal with separation anxiety. It's nothing to be ashamed of, especially after losing your husband. You've been through so much." Separation anxiety. As if my fear for my daughter's safety was a mental health disorder I needed to overcome. I had similar conversations with my friend Linda from the library, with my neighbor Ruth, with the pastor at my church. Everyone had the same response. I was worrying too much. I needed to give Emily space. Young relationships needed room to breathe. Some even suggested gently but firmly that I was the problem, that my loneliness was making me cling too tightly, that I was inventing crises to keep Emily close. "Every mother feels this way," Linda said over lunch one day. "When my Jennifer got married, I thought her husband was all wrong for her too. But it was just my own fear talking. They've been married 15 years now." But this wasn't the same. I knew it wasn't the same. Jennifer hadn't hidden bruises. Jennifer hadn't stopped calling her mother. Jennifer's husband hadn't scheduled psychiatric appointments and accused her of paranoid thinking. Still, the constant pushback made me doubt myself. Late at night, lying awake in my empty house, I'd wonder if they were all right, if I was manufacturing a crisis where none existed, if my grief and loneliness had warped my judgment so badly that I was seeing danger in a man who simply loved my daughter. Maybe David was just protective. Maybe Emily was just busy. Maybe I was a bitter, lonely old woman who couldn't accept that her daughter had found happiness. But then I'd remember the coldness in David's eyes that first night, the way Emily's voice had changed, becoming careful and constrained, the finger-shaped bruises on her wrist, the tremor in her hands when she'd rushed to leave my house, the appointment card with its damning note. Those weren't things I'd imagined. Those were real. The isolation was suffocating. I felt like I was shouting into a void, warning of a fire that only I could see, while everyone else insisted there was nothing but smoke. The worst part was knowing that even if something terrible happened, even if my worst fears came true, no one would believe I'd tried to prevent it. They'd say I was overreacting, being dramatic, seeing problems where there were none. And Emily, my beautiful, strong, intelligent daughter, was growing further away with each passing day. The invisible wall between us was becoming solid, impenetrable. David was building it brick by brick, isolating her from the one person who might help her see the truth. I was losing her. Not to natural independence or the normal separation that comes with adulthood, but to something darker and more deliberate. I was watching my daughter disappear into a relationship that was swallowing her whole, and I was powerless to stop it. 3 months after that first dinner with David, after countless rejected calls and canceled visits, after being told again and again that I was the problem, I couldn't take it anymore. One evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I drove to their house, and what I found on the porch chilled me to the bone. I made the drive on a Tuesday evening just after sunset. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I hadn't called ahead. I knew if I did, David would answer and tell me Emily wasn't available, wasn't feeling well, didn't want visitors. So I just went, driven by an urgency I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. Their house was a small Cape Cod-style home on Maple Street, painted pale yellow with white trim. David's car was in the driveway, but the house was mostly dark, except for a light in what I assumed was the bedroom upstairs. I sat in my car for several minutes, trying to gather my courage, trying to decide what I'd even say when someone opened the door. But when I finally walked up the front path, I didn't have to knock. There, on the third step of the porch, was a folded piece of paper held down by a small rock. At first, I thought it might be a flyer or advertisement left by someone canvassing the neighborhood. But as I got closer, I saw my name written on the outside in pen. I picked it up with trembling hands and unfolded it under the yellow glow of the porch light. "Mom, please don't come again. I need space." The handwriting was wrong. Emily had always had beautiful penmanship, the result of Catholic school training and natural artistic inclination. Her letters were round and flowing, consistent and clear. I had boxes of birthday cards and thank you notes she'd written over the years, each one like a small work of calligraphy. This handwriting was jagged and uneven. Some letters slanted left, while others leaned right. The pressure varied wildly. Some words pressed so hard they'd nearly torn through the paper, while others were barely visible, as if written by a hand that was shaking. The M in Mom had been started twice, one false start crossed out before the second attempt. I stood there on that porch, the note clutched in my hand, and felt something shift inside me. Everyone had told me I was imagining things. Everyone had said I was overreacting. But this was real. This was evidence that something was terribly wrong. I folded the note carefully and put it in my purse next to the appointment card I'd been carrying for months. Then I walked back to my car without knocking on the door. If Emily had written this note and I wasn't at all certain she had, then forcing a confrontation now would only make things worse. But if David had written it pretending to be Emily, then he'd already won this round. He'd know I'd been here and been turned away. Either way, going to the door would accomplish nothing. But sitting at home doing nothing was no longer an option. Over the next week, I did something I never thought I'd do. I began to follow David. Not every day and not obviously. I'm a 63-year-old woman in a silver Honda Civic. I'm not exactly inconspicuous, but I learned his patterns. He left for work at 7:45 each morning, always in his black sedan. He returned home around 6 most evenings. I parked down the street, tucked between a contractor's van and an SUV, and watched. I felt ridiculous and slightly unhinged, like someone from a bad television movie. But what else could I do? Go to the police with a note that might have been written by my own daughter asking me to respect her boundaries, They'd laugh me out of the station. For 3 days, David's routine never varied. Home to work, work to home. On the 4th day, a Thursday, he didn't come home at 6. I waited, watching the house darken as the sun set. At 7:15, his car finally appeared, but instead of turning into the driveway, he drove past. Without thinking, I started my car and followed. He took the highway exit toward the outskirts of town, an area I rarely visited. Strip malls and chain restaurants gave way to older neighborhoods with small businesses tucked into converted houses. He pulled into the parking lot of a cafe I'd never noticed before, a quiet place with dim lighting and only a few cars outside. I parked at the far end of the lot, my heart hammering, and watched. David got out of his car and walked inside. Through the large front windows, I could see him scan the interior, then move toward a back corner booth. He sat down across from someone already there, a woman. Blonde hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail. Even from this distance, I could see she was younger than me, probably around 30. She wore a black dress, elegant and expensive-looking, with a thin gold necklace catching the light. They talked. Not the casual conversation of friends meeting for coffee. This was intense, purposeful. David leaned forward, gesturing with his hands. The woman nodded occasionally, glancing around the cafe as if checking to see if anyone was watching. At one point, David reached across the table and took her hand. Not the gentle clasp of lovers, but something else. A handshake that lasted too long, a deal being made, an agreement being sealed. They sat like that for nearly an hour. I stayed in my car, windows cracked despite the evening chill, watching them through my rearview mirror so I wouldn't have to turn around and risk being seen. My legs cramped. My back ached. But I didn't move. Finally, they stood. David pulled out his wallet and left cash on the table. The woman gathered a small black purse and they walked toward the exit together. In the parking lot, they spoke for another few minutes by her car, a white BMW with out-of-state plates I couldn't quite read. Then she got in and drove away. David stood watching her go before returning to his own car. I slumped down in my seat as his headlights swept across the parking lot. He drove past me without slowing, and I waited a full 5 minutes before starting my own car and heading home. All the way back, my mind raced. My first thought had been the obvious one: David was having an affair. Emily was home alone while her boyfriend met with another woman in a dimly lit cafe. Part of me had almost been relieved by that thought. An affair would be devastating, yes, but it would also be simple, clear. Something Emily would understand and believe. But the more I replayed the scene in my mind, the more certain I became that I'd witnessed something else entirely. The way they'd held hands hadn't been romantic. The intensity of their conversation hadn't been passion. And the woman's constant surveillance of the cafe, her careful glances toward the door and windows, suggested someone who didn't want to be seen. I thought he was cheating, but I was wrong. It was something much darker. I couldn't let it go. That meeting haunted me for days. I replayed it in my mind during sleepless nights, trying to understand what I'd witnessed. Every instinct told me it was important, that it was a piece of a puzzle I desperately needed to solve. So when Thursday evening came around again the following week, I was parked outside David's house at 6 o'clock, waiting. If this was a regular appointment, if this woman was someone he met with consistently, then maybe he'd go back. He did. At 7:30, his black sedan pulled out of the driveway. I followed at a distance, staying 2 or 3 cars back, the way I'd seen detectives do in movies. My hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel. This was madness. I was a retired librarian playing amateur spy, and if anyone I knew saw me, they'd have even more reason to think I'd lost my mind. But I had to know. This time, David didn't stop at the cafe. He drove further into the suburbs, into a neighborhood I'd never visited before. New construction sprouted everywhere, modern apartment complexes with names like Riverside Commons and the Parkview. He turned into one called Meadowbrook Estates, a 3-story building with pale brick and navy blue shutters. I pulled into a visitor spot at the far end of the parking lot and killed my engine. From here, I had a clear view of where David had parked. He got out of his car and walked toward one of the ground floor units. Before he could knock, the door opened. The blonde woman from the cafe stood in the doorway. In the better lighting of the apartment complex, I could see her more clearly. She was pretty in a sharp, angular way, with high cheekbones and a thin frame. She wore jeans and a cream-colored sweater, this time more casual than the black dress from before. David stepped forward and hugged her. I reached for my phone with shaking hands and opened the camera, zooming in as much as I could. The embrace was strange, stiff, and purposeful, rather than warm. Not the way lovers held each other, but not quite the way friends did either. It reminded me of the way business partners might greet each other or people in a conspiracy. The woman pulled back and said something I couldn't hear. David nodded, glanced around the parking lot. My heart nearly stopped and then followed her inside. The door closed behind them. I sat there for a moment, breathing hard, my phone still raised. I'd gotten maybe 3 or 4 photos, though I wasn't sure how clear they'd be in the evening light. But I had something. Evidence. Proof that whatever was happening between David and this woman, it was ongoing and secret. I was about to lower my phone when the apartment door opened again. David stepped back outside alone. And then he turned slowly and deliberately and looked directly at my car. For a frozen moment, we stared at each other across the parking lot. Even from this distance, I could see the recognition in his face. The understanding. He knew it was me. He'd known I was following him maybe for days, and now he'd caught me. He started walking toward me, not running, not hurrying, just walking with calm, purposeful strides across the parking lot. His face was expressionless, unreadable in the amber glow of the streetlights. Terror seized me. My hands fumbled with the keys, dropping them into the footwell. I bent down, frantically groping in the darkness, my breath coming in short gasps. My fingers finally closed around the keys, and I jammed them into the ignition. The engine roared to life. David was halfway across the parking lot now, maybe 50 feet away. I threw the car into reverse, backed out of the spot, too fast, nearly hitting a parked truck. Then I shifted into drive and pressed the accelerator. As I sped toward the exit, I glanced in my rearview mirror. David had stopped walking. He just stood there in the middle of the parking lot, his hands in his pockets, watching me go. The casual confidence of his posture was somehow more terrifying than if he'd been chasing me. I didn't stop shaking until I was back home with my door locked and deadbolted. For the next 3 days, I barely left my house. Every sound made me jump. Every car that drove down my quiet street made me peek through the curtains. I'd been caught. David knew I was investigating him, and I had no idea what he might do with that knowledge. On Saturday morning, I forced myself to go to the grocery store. I couldn't hide forever, and I was running out of food. It was a clear, bright day, the kind of early autumn morning that usually lifted my spirits. But I felt watched, exposed, vulnerable. I took my usual route down the winding road that led from my neighborhood toward the main shopping district. There's a long, steep hill about halfway there, one I'd driven thousands of times over the years. I was about a third of the way down when I pressed the brake pedal. Nothing happened. I pressed harder. The pedal went all the way to the floor with almost no resistance. My car continued accelerating down the hill, gravity pulling me faster toward the intersection at the bottom, where I could see cars crossing. Pure panic flooded my system. I pumped the brakes desperately, uselessly, pressed harder, standing on the pedal with both feet. Nothing. I was going 45 miles per hour now, 50, and the intersection was coming up fast. The emergency brake. My hand shot to the center console and yanked the emergency brake up hard. The car made a horrible grinding sound and lurched, but it was slowing. Slowing. The back end fishtailed slightly as I fought to control the wheel with one hand while keeping the emergency brake engaged with the other. I managed to steer onto the shoulder just before the intersection, the car finally shuddering to a stop in a cloud of dust and burning rubber smell. I sat there, my entire body trembling, my heart slamming against my ribs so hard I thought I might be having a heart attack. A driver in the intersection honked and gave me an angry gesture, assuming I was just a careless old woman who didn't know how to drive. If only it were that simple. I had my car towed to Mike's Auto Repair, a shop I'd been using for years. Mike himself, a man in his 50s, with grease permanently embedded under his fingernails, came out to talk to me after examining the car. His face was grave. "Mrs. Peterson, you're lucky to be alive. Your brake line was almost cut completely through, just a thin piece of metal still connecting. It was only a matter of time before it failed completely." "Cut?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "You mean like an accident, like it wore through?" Mike shook his head slowly. "No, ma'am. This wasn't wear and tear. Someone took a tool to this, probably a razor blade or a sharp knife, made a deliberate cut about 3/4 of the way through, leaving just enough that you wouldn't notice right away. But with normal driving brake fluid leaking pressure on the system," he paused. "Eventually, it was going to give out. Probably on a hill or when you needed to stop fast. Should I call the police?" My voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. "That's up to you. But yeah, I'd recommend it. This is attempted vehicular homicide, Mrs. Peterson. Someone tried to kill you." That's when I realized David knew I was watching him, and he wanted me to stop. Continuation from Part 6. The previous section ended with, "That's when I realized David knew I was watching him, and he wanted me to stop." Current context. Mary has just survived what she now knows was an attempted murder. Someone deliberately cut her brake line, and she believes it was David. She's terrified, but also more certain than ever that David is dangerous. However, she has no real proof that would convince anyone else. She's isolated, dismissed by everyone she's confided in, and now being actively threatened. She's facing a choice: back down and possibly lose her daughter forever, or push forward, knowing it might cost her life. She's a 63-year-old widow with no power or resources going up against a man who's proven he's willing to kill. She's at her most vulnerable and most desperate point. The police station smelled like burnt coffee and antiseptic. I sat in a hard plastic chair in the small lobby, waiting for someone to take my statement, Mike's repair report clutched in my hands like a lifeline. The young officer who finally called my name looked barely old enough to shave, with earnest eyes and a crisp uniform that still had creases from the package. I told him everything. The cut brake line. Mike's assessment that it was deliberate, my suspicions about David Morrison. I even mentioned following him, though I left out some details knowing how it would sound. Officer Bryant, that was the name on his badge, took notes with careful attention. He asked clarifying questions. He nodded at appropriate moments. And when I finished, he set down his pen and gave me a look I'd seen too many times before. Pity mixed with skepticism. "Mrs. Peterson, I understand you're concerned, and tampering with someone's vehicle is absolutely a crime. But without concrete evidence linking Mr. Morrison to this incident, fingerprints, witnesses, camera footage, there's not much we can do. Have you had any direct threats from him? Any documented history of conflict? He's dating my daughter. I've expressed concerns about their relationship, but has he threatened you directly, in writing or in front of witnesses?" "No, but..." Does your daughter know about these accusations? She doesn't believe me. Nobody believes me. The words came out more bitter than I'd intended. Officer Bryant's expression softened even more, which somehow made it worse. Mrs. Peterson, I'm going to be honest with you. Family disputes are complicated. Sometimes, when parents are worried about their adult children's relationships, it can create tension that feels threatening, even when there's no actual danger. We'll file this report and we'll keep it on record. But unless you can provide evidence that Mr. Morrison was near your vehicle or had opportunity to tamper with it, there's really nothing we can investigate. I left the police station feeling more alone than ever. Even with a mechanic's statement that someone had tried to kill me, I couldn't make anyone take me seriously. To them, I was just a worried mother who'd taken things too far. But I wasn't done. I couldn't be done. If the police wouldn't help, if no one would believe me, then I had to do something myself. I had to make Emily see the truth, even if it meant she'd hate me for it. That afternoon, I drove back to Emily's house. My hands were steadier than they'd been in days. Fear had burned through me and left something harder in its place. Determination, maybe, or desperation that looked like courage. David's car was in the driveway. I'd expected that. Part of me had hoped Emily would be home alone, that I'd have a chance to talk to her without him there. But I also knew that was unlikely. David didn't leave her alone much anymore. I rang the doorbell 3 times before anyone answered. When the door opened, it was David. Of course it was. He wore a casual weekend outfit, jeans and a navy sweater, and that same pleasant, controlled expression he always had. But his eyes were cold. They'd always been cold, but now I could see calculation there, assessment. The look of a predator deciding whether I was still a threat worth worrying about. Mary. He didn't open the door wider. His body filled the doorway, blocking any view of the interior. This is unexpected. I need to see Emily, now. Emily's not feeling well today. She's resting. Then I'll wait until she wakes up. Something flickered across his face. Annoyance, maybe, or anger carefully controlled. He leaned against the doorframe, casual and unmovable. You know, Mary, you sound just like her mother did. Always worried, always suspicious, always making up stories about things that weren't there. His voice was soft, conversational, the kind of tone you'd use to discuss the weather. The words hit me like ice water. Her mother? Whose mother? But David just smiled, that cold smile that never reached his eyes. You should go home, Mary. This concern of yours, it's not healthy. Emily is an adult. She's made her choices. You need to respect that. I want to talk to my daughter. My voice was shaking now, but I didn't care. Emily. Emily, it's Mom. Mary, please. David's voice dropped lower, took on an edge. You're making a scene. The neighbors will... Emily, I called louder. And then she appeared behind him. My beautiful daughter, but not. This person wore Emily's face, but everything else was wrong. She'd lost weight. I could see that even in the dim light of the hallway. Her hair hung limp and unstyled. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. She wore an oversized sweatshirt that swallowed her frame. But it was her expression that broke my heart. Empty. Flat. Like someone had reached inside and turned off whatever made her Emily. Mom? Her voice matched her face. No inflection, no emotion. Just a word spoken by someone reading from a script. Please, leave us alone. You're making things worse. I'm happy. Why can't you see that? Sweetheart, you don't look happy. You look... I'm fine. The words came out sharp, the first real emotion I'd heard, but it was anger. At me. You need to stop this. Stop calling. Stop showing up here. Stop trying to control my life. I'm not trying to control you. I'm trying to protect you. From what? Now there were tears in her voice, but her face remained strangely blank. From the man who loves me, from the best relationship I've ever had, or from my own choices, because you can't accept that I'm not your little girl anymore. Each word was a knife. I'd heard them before from other people, but hearing them from Emily was different. Devastating. David stood between us saying nothing, but I could feel his satisfaction radiating off him like heat. Emily, please just listen. No. She wrapped her arms around herself. I'm done listening to you poison my relationship. I'm done with your paranoia and your jealousy and your need to make David into some kind of villain because you can't stand that someone else makes me happy. Her voice cracked. Just go, Mom. Just leave us alone. She turned away before I could respond, disappeared back into the darkness of the house. David watched me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he stepped back and closed the door. I heard the deadbolt slide into place. I stood on that porch for a full minute, unable to move. My daughter had just told me to stay out of her life, had accused me of jealousy and paranoia, had defended the man I was certain was dangerous, maybe even deadly. And David's words kept circling in my mind. You sound just like her mother did. Not Emily's mother, not a mother, her mother. Specific. Past tense. I walked back to my car in a daze, got in, started the engine, drove home on autopilot, my mind replaying those words over and over. Her mother. Always worried, always suspicious, always making up stories. Who was he talking about? What other woman had worried about David Morrison? What other mother had tried to protect her daughter from him? And what had happened to her? I left that house shaking, but his words kept echoing in my mind just like her mother did. Whose mother? And what happened to her? I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying David's words until they became a loop I couldn't escape. Her mother. Not a mother. Not some generic reference. Her mother. Specific and deliberate. He'd been comparing me to someone, another woman, another mother who'd worried about him, who'd been suspicious of him, who'd made what he called stories about him. What had happened to that mother? More importantly, what had happened to her daughter? By morning, I'd made a decision. The police wouldn't help me. My friends and family thought I was paranoid. Emily had shut me out completely. If I was going to find the truth, I'd have to do it myself. Or rather, I'd need to hire someone who knew how to dig up truths that people wanted buried. I found Frank Morrison through a simple internet search for private investigators in the area. His website was basic, almost old-fashioned, with a photo of a man in his early 50s with gray streaked hair and tired eyes. Former police detective, it said. 25 years with the state police before retiring. Specializes in background checks and missing persons cases. Missing persons. The words made my stomach clench. His office was a small room above a tax preparation service downtown. The furniture was worn but clean, the walls covered with framed commendations and photos from his years on the force. Frank himself looked exactly like his website photo, only older and more weathered. He offered me coffee, which I declined, and gestured to the chair across from his desk. Mrs. Peterson, you said on the phone this was about your daughter's boyfriend. I'd brought everything. Printed photos of David that I'd pulled from Emily's social media before she made her accounts private. His full name, address, the license plate number I'd memorized from following him. Even the appointment card with Dr. Stevens' information, though I wasn't sure how relevant it was. Frank spread the materials across his desk, putting on reading glasses to study them. When he looked at David's photo, something shifted in his expression. Not recognition exactly, but the keen interest of someone who'd spent decades reading people and knew when something didn't add up. "You want a background check," he said. "I want to know who he really is." I leaned forward. He said something to me about how I sounded like her mother. Not my daughter's mother, I am her mother. Someone else's mother. Someone who was worried about him before. Frank set down the photo and looked at me directly. "Mrs. Peterson, I need you to be honest with me. What are you hoping to find here? Because sometimes when we go digging into people's pasts, we find things that can't be unfound." "I think my daughter is in danger. I think this man has done something terrible before, and I think he's going to do it again. Everyone tells me I'm paranoid. The police won't help. But I know what I know." My voice was steady. "So yes, I want you to dig. I want you to find everything there is to find about David Morrison. And I don't care what it costs." He quoted me $3,000. I wrote the check that same day, watching a significant chunk of my retirement savings disappear. But what was money compared to Emily's life? Frank told me it would take at least 2 weeks, possibly longer. Those 2 weeks felt like 2 years. I jumped every time the phone rang. I checked my email obsessively. I drove past Emily's house more times than I could count, just to see David's car in the driveway and know she was still there, still alive. When Frank finally called and asked me to come to his office, his voice was grim enough that I knew he'd found something. The file he placed on the desk between us was thick, much thicker than I'd expected for a simple background check. "Your instincts were right," Frank said without preamble. "David Morrison isn't his real name, or rather it's one of several names he's used." He opened the file and pulled out a series of documents. Driver's licenses from different states, each with David's photo but different names. Daniel Winters, Derek Wade. Even the birth dates varied slightly, though the face was unmistakably the same. Daniel Winters lived in Columbus, Ohio from 2015 to 2018. Worked in financial services same as he does now. In 2016, he met a woman named Jennifer Hayes through a dating app. They married 6 months later. By all accounts, the relationship seemed normal at first, but Jennifer's family reported that she became increasingly isolated, stopped attending family events, stopped calling. When they tried to visit, Daniel would say she wasn't feeling well or was too busy. The pattern was sickeningly familiar. In early 2018, Jennifer vanished. Daniel reported her missing, claimed she'd walked out after an argument. Police investigated but found no evidence of foul play. Jennifer's car was found at a bus station 3 towns over. The case went cold. Daniel moved away a few months later. Frank pulled out another set of documents. He surfaced next in Michigan in 2019, this time calling himself Derek Wade. Same job, similar background story. He met a woman named Rachel Thompson through a dating app. Rachel. I remembered that name from David's No Derek's comment, her mother. Rachel was 26 when they met. By all accounts, a smart, capable young woman with a good job and close family ties. They married in early 2020. And then same pattern. She stopped seeing her family, stopped answering calls. Her mother. Frank looked up at me significantly. Her mother became concerned. Very concerned. She reported to police that Derek was controlling, possibly abusive. She tried to get Rachel to leave him. What was her name? I asked, though I already knew. Rachel's mother. Mary Thompson. Same first name as you. Frank flipped through more pages. Mrs. Thompson filed multiple complaints with local police, tried to get a welfare check on her daughter. She was worried Derek was isolating Rachel, controlling her movements, possibly drugging her. Police did conduct a welfare check. Rachel told them everything was fine and that her mother was overreacting. The words could have come from my own mouth. Every detail mirrored my experience exactly. In August 2021, Rachel disappeared. Derek called police, said she'd left him. said she was mentally unstable and had talked about running away. He even provided them with copies of medical records showing Rachel had been seeing a psychiatrist for paranoid delusions about her family. My blood ran cold. The appointment card, Dr. Stevens. Patient shows signs of paranoid thinking toward family members. Rachel's car was found abandoned near a lake 40 miles away. The driver's door was open, her purse was on the seat. But there was no body, no blood, no sign of struggle. The investigation concluded she'd either drowned herself or run away voluntarily. Derek Wade moved out of state shortly after. And David Morrison appeared here about 6 months later. Frank closed the file and removed his glasses. Mrs. Peterson, in my professional opinion, the man your daughter is living with is either the unluckiest person in the world when it comes to relationships, or he's a predator who's refined his technique over multiple victims. 2 wives both disappeared under similar circumstances. Both times, a concerned mother tried to warn authorities and was dismissed as overprotective or interfering. What happened to Mary Thompson? I asked quietly. Rachel's mother. Still alive as far as I know, living in Michigan. I have her contact information if you want it. He paused. But Mrs. Peterson, finding all this gives us evidence of a pattern, not proof of a crime. David Morrison has never been charged with anything. Legally, he's a free man, and unless your daughter is willing to leave him, she won't. The words tasted like ash. She thinks I'm the problem. Then we have to hope the pattern breaks. Frank's expression was sympathetic, but honest. Or we have to find evidence that connects him to one of these disappearances, real evidence, the kind that would hold up in court. I left his office with the file tucked under my arm, my mind reeling. 2 women, 2 identities, 2 families who'd tried to warn their daughters and been dismissed, 2 mothers who'd sounded the alarm and been called crazy. And her mother's name was also Mary. A mother who tried to warn everyone but was called crazy. Just like me. Frank had included Mary Thompson's phone number and address in the file. I stared at it for a full day before I found the courage to call. What would I even say? Hello? I'm another Mary whose daughter is dating the man who probably killed yours. But I had to try. If anyone in the world would understand what I was going through, it was her. The phone rang 4 times before a thin, elderly voice answered. Hello? Mrs. Thompson. My name is Mary Peterson. I think the man who was married to your daughter Rachel is now with my daughter Emily. There was a long silence. Then quietly, Derek Wade. He's calling himself David Morrison now. But yes, I think they're the same person. Another pause. You should come here. This isn't a conversation for the phone. I made the drive the next morning. 6 hours through autumn countryside. Leaves turning gold and red, the kind of beautiful day that felt obscene given what I was driving toward. Mary Thompson lived in a modest ranch house on the outskirts of Ann Arbor, the kind of place that had probably been filled with life and noise once, but now felt eerily quiet. She opened the door before I could knock. She was small and frail, her gray hair pulled back in a loose bun, her eyes sharp despite her age. But it was the expression on her face that struck me. Recognition mixed with terrible understanding. She was looking at a mirror of her own past. Come in, dear, she said softly. Her living room was a shrine to Rachel. Photos covered every surface, a smiling toddler, a teenage girl in a prom dress, a beautiful young woman in a graduation cap. But it was the wedding photo on the mantel that made my stomach drop. Rachel in white, beaming at the camera, and beside her, unmistakably, was David. Derek. Whatever he called himself. That's him, I said unnecessarily. I knew the first time I met him something was wrong. Mary Thompson's voice was distant remembering. The way he looked at her. like she was a possession, not a person. But Rachel was in love. She wouldn't listen. Over tea that neither of us drank, she told me everything. How Derek had isolated Rachel slowly professionally. How Rachel's calls became less frequent, her visits shorter. How Mary had tried to warn the police only to be dismissed as an interfering mother who couldn't let go. How Rachel had finally planned to leave him, had secretly contacted a domestic violence shelter, had been preparing to go to the police with evidence of financial control and psychological abuse. She called me the night before she disappeared. Mary said, her voice breaking. She said, "Mom, I'm getting out. I'm going to the police tomorrow. I have proof." That was the last time I heard her voice. What happened? The next morning, Derek called 911, said Rachel had left after an argument. By the time police got there, Rachel's car was already at the lake doors, open her phone on the passenger seat, showing searches for how to disappear and starting a new life. The police said it was obvious she'd staged her own disappearance. Mary's hands trembled as she set down her teacup. But I know my daughter. She would never leave without saying goodbye. Never. I reached across and took her hand. We sat like that for a long moment, two Marys who'd tried to save their daughters and failed to make anyone listen. "Save Emily," she whispered. "Don't let him do to her what he did to my Rachel." I drove home as the sun set, my mind churning with everything Mary Thompson had told me. The pattern was clear, now refined over years. Isolate, control, gaslight, and when the victim finally tried to leave, make them disappear. Stage it to look like they'd run away. And always, always, there was a mother no one would believe. It was fully dark by the time I reached my house. I noticed immediately that something was wrong. The porch light I always left on was off. And as I got closer, I saw the front door was open just a crack. My heart hammering, I pushed the door wider. I should have called the police, should have stayed in my car. But some desperate part of me hoped Emily was inside, that she'd finally come to me for help. The house had been ransacked. Not violently, there was a precision to it that was somehow more terrifying than chaos would have been. Every drawer in my desk had been opened and emptied. The filing cabinet in my spare room stood open, folders scattered across the floor. My laptop was gone from the kitchen table, but my television was still there. My jewelry box sat untouched on my dresser. The cash I kept in the coffee tin on the counter hadn't been taken. This wasn't a robbery. Someone had been looking for something specific, and I knew exactly what they'd taken: every copy of Frank's investigation file that I'd made, every note I'd written about David's past, every piece of evidence connecting him to Rachel and Jennifer. It was a message. He knew what I'd found, and he'd erased it. I spent 2 hours that night cleaning up, hands shaking, jumping at every creak of the house settling. I barely slept, certain that whoever had been here might come back. 2 days later, the mailman delivered a small, padded envelope. The return address was blank, but the postmark showed it had been sent 3 weeks ago from a post office 2 towns over. My name and address were written in Emily's careful handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a piece of cloth, a handkerchief white with delicate embroidery. I recognized it immediately. I'd given it to Emily for her 28th birthday, had paid extra to have the letter M stitched in the corner in pale blue thread. She'd loved it, said it reminded her of her grandmother. The handkerchief was torn a ragged edge where someone had ripped it in half, and wrapped inside was a crumpled piece of paper, the kind torn from a small notebook. "Mom, stop digging. He knows everything. Please stay safe. I love you, E." The letters were shaky, written in obvious haste. The paper had been folded and unfolded multiple times, as if Emily had written it, hidden it, then pulled it out again to add something else. At the very bottom, almost too small to read, were 3 more words. "He's watching you." I sat on my couch clutching that torn handkerchief and cried for the first time since this nightmare began. Not tears of sadness, but of terrible understanding. Emily had known. She'd known David was dangerous. She'd known he was monitoring my investigation. And she'd sent this warning weeks ago, trying to protect me even while she was trapped with him. The note on the porch, "Mom, please don't come again," hadn't been Emily pushing me away. It had been Emily trying to keep me safe. Every time she'd defended David, every accusation that I was jealous or controlling it had been a performance for his benefit. She'd been protecting me the only way she could, by making David believe she was completely under his control, by making him think I was no longer a threat to his carefully constructed life. But something had changed. 3 weeks ago, Emily had managed to get to a post office to mail this warning. She'd torn her birthday gift in half a symbol I was meant to understand. Help me. Save me. I can't do this alone. For the first time, I realized Emily wasn't trying to push me away. She was trying to save me. But if she sent this 3 weeks ago, where was she now? I tried calling Emily immediately after opening the envelope. The phone rang and rang before going to voicemail. I left a message trying to keep my voice steady. "Sweetheart, I got your letter. Please call me. Please let me know you're okay." I called again an hour later, and an hour after that. By evening, I'd called 9 times. Every call went straight to voicemail as if her phone had been turned off or destroyed. The next day, I called 12 more times. Nothing. The day after that, another 15 calls. Each one sent to that same automated voice, "The person you are trying to reach is not available." On the 4th day, someone finally answered. "Hello, Mary." David's voice was flat, exhausted. Or at least he wanted me to think he was exhausted. "Emily doesn't want to talk to you anymore. You've caused enough damage to our relationship. Please stop calling. Let me talk to her just for 1 minute. She doesn't want to talk to you. She made that very clear. Your constant interference, your accusations, your paranoia, it's been incredibly stressful for her, for both of us. David, please, I just need to hear her voice." "Goodbye, Mary." The line went dead. I sat staring at my phone, my whole body trembling. That had been David's voice, but something about it was different. The usual smooth control was still there, but underneath it was something else. Satisfaction, maybe. Or finality. I couldn't wait anymore. I couldn't sit in my house making useless phone calls while my daughter was in danger. I grabbed my purse and keys and drove straight to Emily's house, barely remembering the route, my mind racing with terrible possibilities. It was just past 10 in the morning when I arrived. The street was quiet, most people at work. David's car sat in the driveway, but the house looked wrong. All the curtains were drawn, even though Emily always loved natural light. The cheerful yellow paint suddenly looked sickly in the gray autumn morning. I knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again, harder, calling Emily's name. The house remained silent. "She's not there." The voice came from behind me. I turned to find Mrs. Chen, the elderly neighbor I'd spoken with briefly once before, standing at the edge of her yard with a watering can. She was a tiny woman, maybe 70, with kind eyes that now looked troubled. "Do you know where she is?" I asked, walking toward her. Mrs. Chen glanced at Emily's house, then back at me, lowering her voice. "I haven't seen her in over a week, not since last Thursday. Usually I see her leaving for work in the mornings or getting the mail in the evening. But nothing. The house has been dark. But David's car is here. He comes and goes, but always alone." She paused, seeming to wrestle with whether to say more. "There was shouting that Thursday night. Terrible shouting. I heard things breaking. Glass, maybe. It went on for a long time and then silence. I almost called the police, but my husband said it wasn't our business. She looked at me with guilty eyes. I should have called. I'm sorry. My legs felt weak. A week ago, yes, Thursday around 8 or 9 at night. I haven't seen your daughter since. I thanked her and walked back to my car on unsteady legs. A week. Emily had been missing for a week, and David had been lying every time I called, pretending she was just unavailable, just not interested in talking to me. This time I didn't hesitate. I dialed 911. 2 officers arrived within 15 minutes, a man and a woman both looking skeptical when I explained the situation. Yes, I was the mother they'd filed a report for about the brake line. Yes, I was the one who'd been told there wasn't enough evidence. I could see them exchange a glance that said this woman again, but they knocked on the door anyway. Procedure, if nothing else. David answered after the 3rd knock. He looked terrible, or at least he'd made himself look terrible. Unshaven hair, disheveled, wearing a wrinkled t-shirt and sweatpants. His eyes were red-rimmed, his whole posture conveying exhaustion and distress. "Officers," he said wearily, "is this about Emily?" "We've received a report that she's missing," the female officer said. "When was the last time you saw her?" David ran a hand over his face. "Thursday night. Last Thursday. We had a fight, a bad one. She said I was too controlling, that her mother had been right all along about me." He glanced at me with an expression that might have been reproach or might have been triumph. "She said she needed space. She packed a bag and left. I haven't heard from her since." "Did she say where she was going?" "No. I tried calling, but her phone goes straight to voicemail. I thought she just needed time to cool off. I didn't realize—" His voice broke convincingly. "I didn't think she'd stay away this long. I'm worried about her." The officers asked if they could look inside. David stepped back immediately, gesturing them in. "Of course. Whatever you need." I followed them into the house I'd only seen from the outside. The living room was dim, with all the curtains closed. But even in the low light, the signs of violence were obvious. A floor lamp lay on its side. Picture frames on the mantel were crooked or missing. And when the male officer opened the curtain to let in light, I saw the damage more clearly. The large mirror on the wall above the couch was shattered, a spiderweb of cracks radiating from a central impact point. Shards of glass still lay on the carpet below it, as if David hadn't bothered to clean up, or wanted us to see. "What happened here?" the female officer asked. "The fight," David said quietly. "Emily threw things. She was so angry. She said I'd ruined her relationship with her mother. She picked up a vase and threw it at me. It hit the mirror." He gestured helplessly at the destruction. "I tried to calm her down, but she just kept saying she had to leave, she had to get away from me." We moved through the house. In the bedroom, dresser drawers hung open clothes scattered on the floor as if someone had packed in a hurry. The bathroom showed a gap on the counter where toiletries had been removed. And on the bedroom floor, half hidden under the bed, was a silver necklace. The officers almost missed it, but I saw it. I knew it immediately. I'd given it to Emily when she graduated college, a delicate chain with a small pendant engraved with her initials. It was broken. The chain had been snapped, the pendant lying separate from the links. "That's hers," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "That's Emily's necklace. I gave it to her. She never took it off." David looked at it with an expression of surprise that was just slightly too perfect. "She must have pulled it off during the fight. Things got pretty heated." The officers bagged it as evidence, along with photos of the broken mirror and scattered belongings. They took David's statement in detail: what time Emily had left, what she'd been wearing, whether she'd taken her car. He answered everything with the weary patience of a man who'd been through a terrible fight with his girlfriend and was now trying to be helpful. Her car's still here, he said, gesturing out the window to where a blue Honda sat in the driveway. She called an Uber or something. I don't know. I was too upset to pay attention. The officers asked me to step outside while they finished interviewing David. I stood in the front yard, hugging myself against the cold, staring at Emily's car. She'd loved that car. Had been so proud when she'd finally paid it off. Would she really have left it behind? When the officers finally emerged, their expressions told me everything I needed to know. They believed David's story. Why wouldn't they? They had a scene that supported it. Evidence of a fight missing clothes and toiletries. A man who seemed genuinely worried and cooperative. And they had me, the overprotective mother, with a history of making accusations. We'll file a missing person report, the female officer said gently. But Mrs. Peterson, adults are allowed to leave their homes voluntarily. If Emily left after a fight and doesn't want to be in contact, there's not much we can do. She's 30 years old. She didn't leave voluntarily. Something happened to her. We'll look into it, but right now there's no evidence of foul play. Just evidence of a domestic dispute. They left. David stood in his doorway watching me with those cold, calculating eyes. And I knew. He'd finally done it. The pattern Mary Thompson had described that Jennifer's family had experienced was now complete with my daughter. Emily hadn't left. Emily hadn't packed a bag and called an Uber and walked away from her life. David had made her disappear, just like Rachel, just like Jennifer. And he'd staged it perfectly, making it look like she'd left voluntarily after a fight, making me look like an obsessive mother who couldn't accept her daughter's choices. And that's when I knew he'd finally done it. My daughter was gone, and I might never see her again. I apologize for the confusion. Let me revise Part 11 to be 200-300 words only. Says, continuation from Part 10. The previous section ended with, and that's when I knew he'd finally done it. My daughter was gone, and I might never see her again. Current context. Mary has just witnessed the police believe David's story that Emily left voluntarily after a fight. She's at her absolute lowest point. Her daughter is missing. David has successfully staged it as a voluntary departure, and the authorities see Mary as an overprotective mother, making baseless accusations. She's isolated, terrified, and powerless. But she's also a mother who refuses to give up, even when the entire world has turned against her. The story hit the local paper 2 days later. Local woman reports daughter missing husband, says she left voluntarily. Online strangers who knew nothing called me toxic, controlling psychotic. This is what happens when parents can't let go. Margaret called voice tight with embarrassment. Mary, you need professional help. Emily left. Accept it. The loneliest nights are when everyone thinks you're crazy. I sat alone, curtains drawn, phone silent, except for cruel messages. Then at 2 a.m., my phone rang. Unknown number. Static. Wind. Then barely audible. Mom. I'm safe. I'm sorry. Emily, where are you? The line went dead. When I called back, the number you have dialed is not in service. But it had been her. My daughter was alive. The next morning, I called Frank Morrison. I need to go to the FBI. We compiled everything, David's aliases, the missing wives, all the evidence, and sent it to the FBI field office. 2 days later, Mrs. Peterson, this is Special Agent Sarah Chen from the FBI. We received your evidence. We need to talk to you as soon as possible. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. But I didn't know then how close my daughter had come to death. 3 days after my FBI interview, I was washing dishes on a Saturday morning. The TV played in the living room background noise to fill the silence. Then I heard a name that made time stop. David Morrison. The plate slipped from my soapy hands and shattered in the sink. I ran to the living room, my wet hands leaving prints on the doorframe. On the screen, a reporter stood in front of a house, cordoned off with yellow police tape. Breaking news, David Morrison, also known as Daniel Winters, and Derek Wade has been arrested this morning following an extensive FBI investigation into multiple disappearances across 3 states. My vision blurred with tears. They'd done it. The FBI had believed me. The camera cut to footage of David being led out in handcuffs, an orange jail suit head down, as reporters shouted questions. He looked smaller, somehow diminished without his controlled smile and calculating eyes. Authorities report that human remains were discovered in the trunk of Morrison's vehicle at a storage facility. DNA testing is currently underway. I gripped the back of the sofa legs, trembling. Then the reporter said the words that destroyed me. The remains are believed to be those of a woman in her early 30s. Police are also searching for Morrison's current wife, Emily Morrison, who has been reported missing for 2 weeks. My legs gave out. I fell to my knees on the living room floor. Was Emily already dead? Was she the woman in the trunk? I don't know how long I stayed on that floor sobbing into the carpet. Hours, maybe. The TV kept playing reporters recycling the same footage, the same terrible words. Woman in her 30s. Missing wife. Human remain. Then the news anchor said something that made me lift my head. We have an update on the Morrison case. The FBI has confirmed the identity of the deceased. She is Jessica Hartley, 32, of Columbus, Ohio. Not Emily. The woman in the trunk wasn't Emily. Sources say Ms. Hartley was an accomplice who helped Morrison prey on his victims through online dating platforms. When she attempted to blackmail him for a larger share of the stolen assets, Morrison killed her. I crawled closer to the TV screen. The blonde woman, the one I'd seen David meeting at the cafe. She'd been his partner, and he'd murdered her. The next morning, every news channel carried the same story. And then I saw her Emily. Grainy surveillance footage showed her being escorted into an FBI building by agents. Her hair was short now, dark brown instead of blonde. She looked thin, pale, but alive. In a dramatic development, the reporter announced, Emily Morrison is alive and has been in FBI protective custody. She escaped 2 weeks ago and provided crucial evidence that led to her husband's arrest. My phone rang. Agent Chen's calm voice. Mrs. Peterson, I have someone who wants to speak with you. A pause. A breath. Then, Mom. Emily's voice trembling and broken. Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't listen. You were right. You were right all along. I couldn't speak through my tears. Could only hold the phone and sob. After 2 weeks of believing I'd lost her forever, my daughter was coming home. But the nightmare wasn't over yet. A week later, Agent Chen called with an address. Mrs. Peterson, Emily is ready to see you. The FBI safe house was an hour away, a nondescript ranch home in a quiet suburb that could have been anywhere. 2 agents stood outside. One checked my ID before letting me through the door, and then I saw her. Emily stood in the living room backlit by afternoon sun streaming through the windows. She'd lost at least 15 pounds. Her hair, once long and honey blonde, was now cut short and dyed dark brown, a disguise I realized. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. She wore an oversized FBI sweatshirt and jeans that hung loose on her frame. But she was alive. She was standing. She was here. Mom, she whispered. We met in the middle of that strange, sterile living room and held each other while I cried harder than I'd ever cried in my life. Not tears of grief anymore, but of relief. So profound it felt like my body was releasing months of accumulated terror all at once. I'm so sorry, Emily sobbed into my shoulder. I'm so sorry, Mom. You tried to warn me and I pushed you away. I said such horrible things to you. Shh, you're here. You're safe. That's all that matters. We sank onto the couch together, my arm around her thin shoulders, neither of us willing to let go. Agent Chen sat in a chair across from us, giving us privacy, but remaining present as protocol required. Slowly, with frequent pauses to collect herself, Emily told me everything. How she'd started noticing things, David's controlling behavior, escalating the way he monitored her, constantly isolated her from everyone she loved. How she'd found the old phone hidden in the basement, filled with photos and messages about women who looked like her, women who'd disappeared. I recognized one of them from your investigation, Emily said quietly. Rachel. I saw her picture on the phone and I knew everything you'd been trying to tell me was true. He'd done this before, and I was next. She'd started gathering evidence, then secretly photographing documents while David slept, copying files from his computer when he was in the shower. But David had sensed something was wrong. The night I'd heard shouting, according to Mrs. Chen, David had confronted Emily about her behavior, accusing her of planning to leave him. When I heard he'd cut your brake line, Emily's voice broke. When I realized he was willing to kill you just to keep you from interfering, I knew I was out of time. If I didn't act, he'd kill us both. The night David went to meet Jessica to kill her, though Emily hadn't known that at the time Emily had fled. She'd taken her evidence, left everything else behind, and driven to the nearest police station. But remembering how they'd dismissed me, she'd asked for the FBI instead. I told them everything, showed them everything. They put me in protective custody that same night while they investigated. She squeezed my hand. I couldn't call you. They said if David knew I was alive and talking, he might run. Or he might. She didn't finish the sentence. A month later, after David's arrest made national news and Emily's role as a whistleblower became public, we returned to our town together. The difference was staggering. Neighbors who'd avoided me now stopped us on the street to apologize. Mary, I'm so sorry we didn't believe you. Former friends showed up at my door with flowers and tears. We should have listened. Even Officer Bryant, the young cop who'd taken my brake line report, came to my house in civilian clothes. Mrs. Peterson, I'm sorry we didn't take you seriously, ma'am. You saved your daughter's life because you didn't give up even when no one believed you. I didn't feel angry at any of them, just tired. I just wanted my daughter safe, I said simply. That's all a mother ever wants. But even as we held each other, I knew the hardest part was still ahead. David's trial, and the truth of what he'd done to all those women. 6 months after David's arrest, the trial began. Cameras lined the courthouse steps. National news crews fought for position. Inside, I sat behind Emily in the courtroom, close enough to touch her shoulder when she needed strength. She took the witness stand on day 3, wearing a navy suit, her hair grown out slightly. Her voice shook at first as she recounted years of psychological abuse, control, and terror. But as she continued describing the hidden phone, the photos of missing women, the evidence she'd gathered while living with a killer, her voice grew stronger. David sat at the defense table in a gray suit, his lawyer whispering strategies. But his eyes never left Emily. That same cold, calculating stare I'd seen at my dinner table so long ago. The prosecution presented everything. Financial records showing David had stolen from his victims, testimony from Rachel Thompson's family, DNA evidence linking him to Jessica Hartley's murder, phone records proving he'd stalked his victims for months before they disappeared. The jury deliberated for just 2 hours. Guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, kidnapping, fraud, interstate stalking. The judge's voice was steady as she read the sentence. Life in prison without possibility of parole. As the verdict was announced, David turned in his seat and looked directly at Emily. That stare that used to make her shrink, used to make her doubt herself. But this time, Emily didn't look away. She met his eyes and said clearly, loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear, "You don't control me anymore." 3 months into his sentence at a maximum security federal prison, the news broke during my morning coffee. David Morrison found dead in his cell. Prison officials report he was attacked by another inmate. An investigation is underway. Later reports would reveal the inmate was a father whose daughter had gone missing in 2017, a man who'd recognized David from the news and decided to serve his own justice. That afternoon, I received a handwritten letter from Emily. "Mom, he thought he was smarter than everyone. He thought no one would ever stop him. But he forgot mothers never forget and daughters never forgive. The world is safer now. Thank you for never giving up on me. Love, Emily." 1 year after the trial, I visited my husband's grave on a warm spring afternoon. The cemetery was peaceful dogwoods in bloom birds singing. I knelt beside his headstone and whispered, "You were right, honey. Our Emily is stronger than both of us. She survived hell and came out the other side." In the distance, near the cemetery gates, Emily stood in a yellow sundress. In her arms was a 6-month-old baby girl with dark curls my granddaughter named Mary after me, and after the other Mary who'd lost her daughter. Emily had rebuilt her life. Found love again with James, a kind teacher who'd waited patiently while she healed. Started therapy. Wrote a book about her experience that would help other women recognize the signs of coercive control. The scars would always be there. Some nights she still woke from nightmares. But she was living, thriving, raising a daughter who would grow up knowing that women's voices matter, that mothers' instincts should be trusted, that love should never feel like a cage. And I knew then, justice doesn't always come easy. But it comes. Sometimes through the courtroom. Sometimes through a mother's relentless love. And always, always through the strength of a daughter who refused to stay silent. Emily had taken back her life. And that was the sweetest revenge of all. If this story moved you, if Mary's fight to save her daughter resonated with your own experiences or fears, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Stories like this need to be told because somewhere right now, another mother is being called crazy for trying to protect her child. Another woman is being isolated by someone who claims to love her, and they need to know they're not alone. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below telling us what you think. Have you ever had that gut feeling about someone that nobody else believed? Have you been the friend who didn't listen when someone tried to warn you? This is a space for those stories, those truths, those hard conversations we need to have. Mary's story reminds us that a mother's instinct is not paranoia. It's not jealousy. It's not control. Sometimes it's the only thing standing between life and death. Emily survived because her mother refused to give up, even when the entire world turned against her. Even when she had nothing left but her own certainty that something was terribly wrong. If you're in a relationship where someone monitors your every move, isolates you from family, makes you doubt your own reality, please know this is not love. Real love doesn't require you to cut off everyone who cares about you. Real love doesn't make you feel trapped. And if you're a mother whose instincts are screaming that something is wrong, trust yourself. Document everything. Reach out to professionals. Don't stop fighting, even when no one believes you. Subscribe for more true stories of survival justice and the unbreakable bonds between mothers and daughters. Because these stories matter. Your voice matters. And together, we can make sure no one suffers in silence. What did you think of Mary and Emily's story? Let us know in the comments below.